Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have one quick administrative announcement before we hand it over to our speakers to kick off the session. This session has been pre-qualified to support continuing education requirements for several cybersecurity certifications. If you are a member seeking attendance documentation, please be sure to scan your badge at the scanner located in the back of the seating area at the conclusion of this session. Scanners shut off 15 minutes post-session, so please get your badge scanned before networking with the speakers. Also note that to qualify for CEUs or CPEs, the session must run a full 60 minutes. That 60 minutes can include Q&A, so please have questions ready for the speakers to fill the time requirement. Full details on the continuing education program are available in the TechNet Cyber app and the conference website. Thank you, and now over to our speakers.
Good morning. Good morning. Sorry for being a minute or two late. This is really designed to be an interactive session, iterative of some exercises that were done at West Point Army Cyber Institute, designed to help elicit an understanding of how responses would kind of evolve over a cyber incident. There have been a number of activities like Cyber Yankee and some other exercises that were part of this. How many in here have heard of the Jack Voltaic exercises? Have you participated in them? Okay. Can y'all hear me clearly? My voice is not really great, so
Trust him. You want him speaking, not me.
Okay, I'll try to do a little bit better. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning. I'm Marina Alvarez, retired Fed from the State Department. I spent 10 years in the Marine Corps in the air traffic control world, and at Justice, I owned the Class B network for a software development shop. So I have the experience of being responsible for everything that touched that network. And I spent the last 7 years at State Department being the acting PM for the Identity, Credential, and Access Management Program, Okta, SailPoint, and Radiant Logic, and establishing the security and MFA for that. So I have a little experience with incident response.
And by way of some extended history, my actual interest in a lot of this goes back to my days in public safety. In the public safety realm, you do exercises all the time, and you do them for a variety of reasons. We don't seem to have done them in the cybersecurity realm. What we generally do is a very pointed, very specific test, and then we move on and say we're successful, but we really haven't tested the overall environment. So the first question here is, why do y'all do exercises? When you do any kind of exercises, one, what kind of exercises do you do, and then why do you do them? We do have to fill up the hour, so you go ahead.
Soft-spoken.
Yeah. Usually in my agency, I'm state, Virginia IT agency, usually we do pretty pointed tabletops that I kind of feel are a little bit too guided, honestly. Sometimes they sort of kind of expect what's going wrong. They don't necessarily add in an element of chaos that I feel like is missing during a real incident.
We used to joke when I used to do we did like search and rescue exercise, right? And I would start the exercise off like somebody's going to die today. And you want the unexpected. And we had people in the middle of the exercise that would just say, I can't handle this, and then leave and go home, which is really not acceptable, right? But what you're really doing is challenging the way that they think. So, the first thing, and Marina, you were talking about muscle memory, right? When you have an exercise, the first sign of a disaster or any kind of critical event is to recognize you're there, right? Is something abnormal is going on, something bad has happened. You can't say, well, I'll look at it in the morning, because it doesn't get better overnight. And generally people find out about it and they start calling you and saying, hey, what are you going to do? How are you going to handle this? So muscle memory is the first thing. I know you've had experience with some of that.
One example, and I swear to God, it really did happen. Time frame, I can tell you it was last like 3-4 years. Having Okta as our IDP for State Department, we had an issue that was escalated up to basically the CIO's office. We were having people who randomly could not log into any of the Okta protected apps. You would log in, no problem. The guy sitting right next to you would fail. Then we had people in other parts of the world that were able to get in and not in the States, and we couldn't figure out what was going on. So we kicked off incident response, and we started. 4 hours later, we still couldn't figure out what it was. I have to thank Okta. They scolded us and said, if you ever have anything like that going on again, let us know. We'd rather be in on the start than at the end. Found out that, for all you guys who don't know, Okta is a cloud product and all that stuff, so they have their own defense mechanism and stuff like that. Well, they had another client who was under DDoS attack. And to protect them, they gathered all the IP ranges that were there and cut them off. Accidentally cutting off one of our inbound IP addresses. So it was, imagine commercial power, you have 3 phases. They cut off one of our pipes, so we only had 2 pipes coming in. And therefore, it was random. If you got on one of those 2 pipes, you were getting in. And we spent 4 hours. And after about 30 minutes, they were like, yeah, sorry, we fixed it. But we spent 4 hours under the CIO's eye looking like we didn't know what the heck we were doing. And it was an honest to God, when you're grabbing that IP range to block, someone slid that little thing a little too far over, and we were okay, and we were able to stand down the incident, but it made for an interesting after-action report. And it's like, if you have those providers like that cover so much of your infrastructure, call them, add them to the list. And if all they do is listen and say, yep, we're good on our side, it shortens the time of the incident and lowers the criticality of the incident and lowers the visibility, so the CIO, the boss, isn't headhunting. Obviously, I kept my head, but lesson learned.
Good.
So with that, where do you think that vendors sort kind of sit within that process? A lot of the times...
And we'll get to that.
Okay.
That's actually a really good point. So we were talking about why you do exercises, and so I'll come back to that. Right?
Okay.
So the first thing is muscle memory. We talk about setting exercises up, setting expectations, but it's also how do you identify success? And sometimes success can be as simple as, do I know who to call? Do I have the right numbers? Do I know the processes? Are they part of my plan? And the second side of that is, do they know who I am? So when I call saying, I need help, something's going wrong, are they going to say, who are you and why do you have this number? It's not a good way to start a disaster. So we said muscle memory. What's another reason why you do exercises?
So another reason why you do exercises is you identify requirements that
Yes.
you didn't know until you did it, that you needed to have this training or you needed this piece of equipment or something happened that you didn't happen the last time. So you mark that down so you can evolve it for the next exercise.
So I was at AT&T for 27 years, and they have a disaster response team for telecom, and they would do these exercises 3 or 4 times a year where they would bring in 17 or 18-wheelers that had their own canteen, they had cadaver dogs, they had just trailers of wire and stuff, and they would go into Miami and say, okay, a hurricane has hit, and we're going to have to rebuild the knock and get the city back up and running. The first day, they developed a scenario. The second day, they would bring in key partners, federal partners and stuff like that. The Wednesday would be state and local. Thursday would be the full exercise with some key, like utilities, things like that are not government. And on Friday, they would spend a full day doing a debrief. They did this at last time that I attended. They had been doing this for more than 14 years. Every time they did an after action, they added new requirements because you find stuff out that you don't know. And it really, and one of the things that we've gotten from these exercises, the Jack Voltaic exercises, is that they're very, very process centric. So if you've ever done like disaster drills on paper, they're kind of boring. Now, we have a guy that's helped us out in Atlanta from CISA that we joke that he's a dungeon master, because he will look at you and see if you're getting complacent or if you're like, oh, I already got that. And then he's got his little Rolodex. He'll just pull out a roll of the die, and you're going to get something strange on there. So it's actually pretty good. So what's another reason why you do an exercise? This is one, a lot of things, so that's the best one, right? Find new requirements. But why do a lot of people really do exercises?
Do you really want your paramedic to try and figure out how to do CPR with bullets flying and you're the victim?
Practice, and practice in a real environment. Practice isn't as real. So we were talking earlier, going back to my paramedic days, you got book learning, you've got didactic tests, and then you have to go into the emergency room and do stuff, and then you partner with a paramedic who trains you. But then when you hit it yourself, you're by yourself, and if your thinking isn't there, we were joking. My very first code that I worked, I got on the scene. I'd been an EMT paramedic for a while. Now I'm in charge. This lady was cooking bacon, hit the bacon, had a code. So I get there, and we're assessing her start to CPR, and I pull out the paddles, and I'm like, is bacon conductive? Is bacon grease conductive? Am I about to fry myself?
The floor's covered in it.
Yeah, so you don't know. And it's the same thing when you're talking about cyber world. When things are happening, who has access, who's there, who's participating. But that actually wasn't what I was going for. The biggest reason people do these is because you're told you have to. Your insurance says you have to, legal says you have to, and what a crappy way to set up an exercise, right? Because we have to be here so that we can check a box off and say that we did the exercise. When you get a pen tester that comes in and says, I did this, you check one thing one day, and you can walk off and say, we're going to do it again next year.
For you military and former military, I'm aging myself, I'm older than dirt. You guys have participated in the combined armed exercises in 29 Palms. It's where the whole military goes out there and practices, tank movements, air raids, dump and bomb. 29 Palms is the world's largest bombing raid. I was in the middle of a CAX in February, I think it was 88, when an F-18 was on fire when it hit the runway tower. The refuelers found out in the after action, filled it up. I can't verify this is true, but it was told that they forgot to put the fuel cap back on the aircraft. Guess who was a senior NCO at the air traffic control tower? So they were going through this. Thankfully, the pilot, the XO of the squadron, decided to take dummy ammo and not real ammo. So he was a fire being the tower, punched. Anybody been to 29 Palms? No?
NTC, the other side.
You know what the runway is.
Same here, 88.
You know what the runway is. Aluminum matting. 2 feet wide, 12 feet long, 144 pounds. We were in the middle of a CAX. And luckily the pilot survived. He punched out at the end of the runway, but he destroyed 4,000 feet of our runway in the middle of a CAX and landed the plane, or placed the plane at the end of the berm in the sand. I was 21 at the time, in charge of the air traffic control tower. FAA rules applied. I had to make sure the air traffic controller was sealed away and drug tested afterwards. But how many of you at 21 know exactly what to do when an airplane hits the ground and everybody's alive? It was an interesting thing, but the one thing that the EAF got an award for is that CAX wasn't canceled. We kept VSTOL operations going.
What's the mission? Submission.
So I'm sorry for the civilians. VSTOL is vertical takeoff and landing. So basically, aircraft, the F-18s and the Harriers, well, the Harriers could, but they kept doing it out further away in VSTOL landings. So we were working 24/7, replacing the runway, keeping the exercise going, and keeping all the training events going for the exercise, and completed it successfully. So, Semper Gumby, you got to know. Yes, sir.
So I think the other reason we do this training is like you said, to maintain proficiency and to gauge the level of proficiency so the next training can...
Bring the young ones in and help them get acclimated, right? I mean, that's it.
Yep, so the next training can...
Recovery, I'm sure, updated the procedures to have somebody else verify that the gas cap was put on the aircraft afterwards and not destroy another version of our runway.
And it's not really commonly known. So, and we'll talk about the structure of the Jacksonville Tech exercise in a minute. But AFCEA has been, and I've been an advocate within, I did some work with West Point, Army Cyber, and we've been advocating getting AFCEA involved with these exercises because we think that there's a lot of good opportunity there. We had been actively planning a Jacksonville Tech exercise in Baltimore last year, right up until the point the bridge got hit by a boat. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, no exercise this year. We're going to take a step back. I actually advocated continuing with the exercise. I think, if you can't learn stuff in the middle of a disaster because you've got people, eyes on you, you've got resources that are committed to you, this is the best time. And it might really suck to be in charge, but, a lot of times it sucks to be in charge. So if you can take, learn lessons on the fly like these things. And so, taking it, did you have your hand up or? Oh, okay. So taking a step back on the Jacksonville Tech exercise, just so that we have a frame of reference, the idea, and actually the very first one was a financial exercise in New York in 2015. But the idea is, if there is a cyber event, what would the impact be on force projection? So, and it's not all DOD, so it does involve other government, but they generally test multiple areas of critical infrastructure. So think like DOD, EPA, DOT, healthcare, communications, all the 16 areas. They test multiple areas at a time, and they test all levels of government. So you've got federal, state, local, and then public-private partnerships like utilities or like, say, AT&T or some partner that might be key in a local area. And then they develop a scenario that is quite often either something that they might anticipate coming up or areas that they think they're particularly vulnerable about. And a lot of times those are coming from the headlines. And we're working with companies right now that are trying to garner some stuff through like AI, taking stuff around the world and all. But the first one we did in Atlanta was assuming FIFA was coming to Atlanta. Say, okay, what might happen? But you kind of work backwards. And what really happened in that one was that the Watershed Authority was attacked. But it doesn't show up like that. What you just get is a phone call, there's been an accident at headquarters. And then so if you're the Watershed Authority, what is your what is your response? If somebody calls you and says, a car hit headquarters, what are your questions? And y'all can shout them out. What do you think?
Well, are you following the ICS process so people are getting...
Well, just follow the shit's happening process, right? Somebody calls you and says, there's been an accident at headquarters, because we're not even in a cyber world yet. In today's world, you're in the cyber world before you even know it. But say a car hits, there's been a wreck. You see it on the news. Grandpa hit the gas instead of the brakes and whatever, right? So what are your first responses? Yeah. How long ago did it happen? Is everybody okay? Did it impact operations? Are their customers impacted? Is it an ongoing scene? Is it under control? And then you start thinking, is it a terrorist attack? Is it, was it on purpose? Was it an accident?
Was it a medical emergency? Was it Grandpa fell asleep at the wheel?
Were there secondary things going on? And then how long till you can resume normal operations? It wasn't It wasn't a normal thing. It was a terrorist attack, right? So it was a purposeful attack. But what they did is then you go through and you have these turns like you do in like a cybersecurity exercise and say, okay, City of Atlanta. So in the room, over the course of the day, we had the City of Atlanta, we had Hartsfield Airport, we had the Watershed Authority, we had the Air Force, the Army, Homeland Security, the FBI, FirstNet, Georgia Tech Authority, Georgia National Guard, Georgia Cyber Center, AT&T, CrowdStrike, a couple of universities for some structure, and I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two, but there were about 70 people that participated in the exercise from 20-odd organizations. And so they would go through and say, okay, how would you respond to this? And, so you get, like, if you get to, like, say, in this area, Dobbins Air Force Base. So you've got somebody that represents the base, and they say, what do you do when you hear, and sometimes it's just on social media, there might be a thing going on. What is your response if you hear there's been an attack at the Watershed Authority? What do y'all think? Do I have a duty to respond? And does it impact my people? And so, right off the bat, the base was like, I'm federal, so I don't have a duty to respond. Well, then where does your base get its water? Where do your people get the water that are coming to work in? Because now we're thinking second, and you're dealing a lot of times with civilians that are not familiar with the concept of kill chain. They're not familiar with even IT, OT operations where you've got so many things connected now that people don't think about all of the things the ramifications. So, we're working through the exercise over the course of the day. What is your incident response plan? Do you have one? Are you following it? And the idea here is, I feel like I'm talking a lot, Marina, so. But the idea...
I want to see if your voice will really give out or will it land.
Make my wife happy. But the idea here is we assume everybody is professional, everybody knows what they're doing, everybody has had proper training. The real thing is, did your plan attend to these things? Did your plan get implemented properly? And did you recognize when there were issues?
The secondary thing was, okay, social media took over. And telling everybody at the watershed, you get the day off, congratulations, prepaid day off. And
who's going to call in and check? Is that real?
We have recall rosters in the military where it's like you do this. Most civilian agencies, cities, towns don't think about these things. If millennials see it on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, it's the truth. So it's like, was the account hijacked as a follow-on to the threat actor who took out the watershed? Was it an authorized communication from the city? Or are they depleting or getting your staff not to show up so you don't have the resources to deal with this emergency? This is where, having been at State Department and dealing with embassies and consulates overseas, where, as you guys know, well, maybe you don't know, but in the military, we rotate out. In the Marine Corps, I had an SOP. This is my job. This is what I had to do. And to do my job, I needed to do, wake up in the morning, brush my teeth, do all these things, do PMS, all that stuff. Civilian worlds don't have that. So in the embassies, when you rotate out, your foreign affairs or your public affairs person changes. So they have to do the pass down of, okay, now you're assuming the password and the accounts for this to put official government information or city information out to the public. So I introduced the concept of privileged access management. All those verified public-facing Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever social media you use, should be under privileged access like your DBA is for your town, for your database, because it's people think it can't be weaponized. Everything is a tool or a weapon. So if that Facebook, Instagram, Twitter message says, don't come to work, people are going to trust it. You'll have the people like my age, the grandmas, grandpas, who'll be like, I don't know shit. I don't got social media. They're going to call their boss and ask, or they're going to verify the information. A lot of people won't. They said, free day off, without verifying it. So now you're low on manpower. How do you respond to an actual incident that requires the bodies?
And that was actually one of the I don't want to say a gotcha for the day, because again, this is not a gotcha environment. This is a learning environment. But whenever they were saying that the social media was being defaced, you could see the officials from the city of Atlanta were like, we're IT, social media is not our problem. But
Guess who immediately inherited the problem?
who are they going to call when the marketing guys get in the morning and find out that all of their stuff's been hijacked? And it might not be part of your plan, but it immediately becomes part of your plan, because if you don't take it, they're just going to call the mayor, and the mayor's going to say, fix it. And, no, there's no discussion. So when you look at these exercises, there's a lot of problems, and a lot of them are administrative, right? First off, who's going to participate? How do you get everybody in a room spending a day when most of them have jobs and have obligations to do, and you say, okay, come sit for 8 hours or 4 hours and work through this with some of your people that are in the same role, but you probably don't know. And so one of the things we do is try to get them to know each other. But from the very beginning, when you look at what kind of scenarios might we look at, and part of that is a bargaining chip. So you say, okay, I want to get the Georgia Tech Authority to participate. What do you guys worry about? What would get you guys to show up? And so sometimes this is a months-long process where you go back and forth, and sometimes you have to sign NDAs, because if you're testing the incident response plan, then you say, okay, I need to see your incident response plan. A lot of times they don't want to share that. They don't want to publish that. But how do you rub these against others and say, okay, what's going to happen when everybody's doing their own incident response plan if everybody doesn't have that shared together?
If we don't talk about it, how do we know who to call and when to call? I can't think of a better analogy, so please forgive me. You have to
Are we in
treat-
Fight Club? Don't talk about it.
You have to treat every unwitnessed death as a murder until you've proven it's natural causes. Because if they would have ignored the social media post, they would have not realized that they were being under a ransom or cyber attack. And you know what your insurance company is going to do? Deny and not pay out. So if you have anything reason to suspect, like I learned with Okta, call the FBI, the GBI, whoever is your senior law enforcement, and get them on the phone immediately. You may not end up needing their service because you find out it was just, a severed brake line that took out that took out the guy's vehicle before he hit your building. But wouldn't you rather be prepared with evidence for any prosecution or any ransomware or insurance payout? It's be prepared. It's.
Well, one of the things when we were making the pitch to have these exercises in Atlanta, and the idea is that they are going to move and they're going to evolve, but we were saying that Atlanta has had critical infrastructure compromises since the Civil War, since Sherman marched through.
They haven't learned yet?
Yeah, well, but you look at what's happened. So everybody, or most people are familiar with Atlanta having ransomware, like it shut down the courts, and ticketing, and everything in Atlanta for months. You may not have heard there was somebody that was sleeping under a bridge in I-85 that burnt down the interstate. It's like, what the heck did he have in his backpack? But that created a crisis for the city for traffic because it happened to be right outside of CDC and by Emory, one of the heaviest congested areas in an already kind of congested area for the city of Atlanta. All of a sudden, they're going to crisis mode. They called every major company in the city, AT&T, UPS, Delta, and said, can you guys work from home? Can they carpool? Can you have them park and ride MARTA? They contacted Uber and rideshare, all these Lyft, and said, okay, can you do group pricing? And all of these things got together because it was such an impact on the city. And then a couple of years ago, they had Colonial Pipeline. and you talk with the guys at Homeland Security who are responsible for Colonial Pipeline, they were very familiar. What they didn't know is that there was that one, point in just north of Atlanta that was going to shut down the entire eastern pipeline.
Kill chain.
So we've had in the city of Atlanta, what is the common element there? They are all disparate. They're completely different, but they have had an outsized impact. So when you're developing these exercises, you have to kind of say, okay, what are the exercises? What are we testing? Who can we get involved? How can we get them to participate? And even then, so we had an exercise planned last year. It wound up being on election day.
Pure luck. No, it's like the rice. A devious-minded dungeon master rolled the dice, and that's where it ended up.
Yeah. I mean, but it's economics, right? So when you're setting up these conferences, what dates are available? Where can I do it? And when you're setting up the exercise, getting people to pay for it and show up. We had the exhibit hall the day before the conference, so we had this space for free, and people were coming in town for the conference. So this has been advertised for 6 months. 2 weeks before the exercise, it went viral on the internet with millions and millions of hits. And people who had no idea what a cybersecurity exercise are were like accusing us of stealing the election. People that should know better. I mean, there were all kinds of stuff, and it's online. You can Google it. There was a New York Times article about it. Rand Paul wrote a letter to Alexander Mayorkas asking why they were doing exercises on Election Day, which they weren't. I mean, so there's a great level of ignorance on this.
Because those killer tabletop exercises where you move people and paper targets are really dangerous, aren't they?
So we had to go into our kind of exercise. I got dozens and dozens of emails and voicemails and texts saying that was everything from a traitor to a moron. And at some point in time, we wound up moving the conference out because we were afraid that there might be some physical activity. So you don't want to be anything like that. We're apolitical. But it became an exercise on the exercise, right? When you do these kinds of things, so and it just gets better and better. So we redid the exercise for late February. 2 weeks before was when Trump announced you have to be in your office Monday through Friday or you're going to be fired. So getting people to participate in the exercise becomes a Herculean effort. And even the guy we joke about, the Dungeon Master, he could not officially speak at the conference, but what he could do was facilitate an exercise. So if you see anything in the press, it was like he's facilitating this exercise. It's like, what difference does that mean? But, in this environment, you have to work with the kind of framework they've got. And then the week of the conference, Trump said, you can't use your credit card. So we were challenged at every level. But we're stubborn. We're going to be doing it again. So we're already starting for the development of these exercises. And that kind of brings us to, when you're developing the exercise, what is your end goal? So, I said earlier that if you know phone numbers and people to contact, that's, kind of like the best thing. But other than like muscle memory and what you were talking about, new requirements or new guidelines for it, what else might you learn?
Well, it seems like those are the two big ones. Like determining who you want to talk to, first of all, and also shaking up this capability gap. That's one of the things. I mean, for the unexpected ones that come up, like nobody really wants to execute rapid runway repair on an expedition.
Right.
Nobody really wants to put shock paddles on somebody in a pool of bacon bricks, right?
But the thought exercise is what matters on these.
Bingo, exactly. You're going to have those unplanned fog of war type situations where you pretty much have to respond to everything. So it does help tell us who you want and who maybe aren't necessarily.
I don't know if y'all read, there's this theory about like when you interview people for a job, you ask them a difficult question, and the answer doesn't really matter. What really matters is how they approach it. And I used to think this was dumb until I actually did some interviews, and I had two guys that were like, but that wouldn't happen. I'm like, okay, suppose it did, suspend reality, and they literally could not respond. They were like, it just wouldn't happen. And it's like, how do you think this interview is going? How do you think, you're in here, you want to be in charge of a scene or something. And I have seen people in the cyber realm look at stuff and say, well, that's not possible or that's not happening. And then you're like, well, it is. What do you look at? How do you handle that?
To me, everything that you're outlining, you're following the ICS, the FEMA ICS process that we use for incidents. I work for customs, and you're following it to a T so far with everything you described. There'll be an incident commander, there'll be logistics, there'll be a call tree with alternate plans of communication
Yep.
to reach people. Sometimes it might even be by face-to-face courier because you can't get them any other way. So to me,
Yeah.
that's how you're following.
We were talking about SneakerNet, right?
Yeah.
If the internet's down, what do you do? Well,
Believe it or not, God, I'm just realizing how many of these crazy things I've been involved with. When I was working with Department of Justice, my system was not critical to anybody but our customers. CGIS wouldn't have cared, DEA wouldn't have cared, nobody would have cared unless they were actually doing the asset forfeiture program. At the time, DOJ's data center was in Rockville. It was older than dirt, was not a top-tier quality data center, and they were doing PMs. It was, I think, 2014, maybe 2010, and they were having to do repairs on being able to switch from commercial power to battery backup for the data center. Don't know exactly what it is, but I'm imagining a big Mord with a switch going, and switch over so you can do stuff. Was in Disney World at 3 o'clock in the morning, got a phone call that says the motherboard fried as they were trying to do the PMs, and it was no longer available for purchase because it was so obsolete. The whole entire data center went down. And I was just like, thank God it's not my problem. But the thing is, they were unprepared. They didn't know how to contact anybody because the data center was down, the email server was down. They had no printed phone numbers to go to analog mode. They didn't know who to call. They just knew my number because I was a pain in the butt customer to them. The only thing I could do was contact my SCS and tell her, nothing's going to be working tomorrow morning, but it's not our problem. And I started our call tree. But the data center itself was not prepared to do the analog redundant backup to make sure its customers knew that at 2 o'clock in the morning they were hard down and nothing was properly shut down for when they got commercial power back. It can happen when you least expect it.
so real quickly in the communications realm, we're getting to the point where little changes are critical. That first hit me about 20 years ago. I was sitting in an airport, and BlackBerry had an outage. And it was national news on all the channels. I mean, they were like, what's going to happen today? And BlackBerry had a very good position within the federal government at that time. If you had a government phone, there's a really good chance it was a BlackBerry. Then all of a sudden, all your email was gone, all your communications were out. That's only gotten worse. That's 20 years ago. So one of the things that we try to get from these exercises, and to going back to your point, lessons learned. So we've been working with some of the universities, and at its heart, West Point is an academic institution. So there's this kind of like, we like to do the operation stuff where the stuff hits the road. But then West Point says, well, what are the data points? What did we learn? How do we look at the trends? Are things getting better or worse? Are we able to respond faster or more appropriately? And so the ultimate goal, the kind of holy grail, is for us to have these exercises. Historically, West Point's taken about 1.5 to 2 years to do one, because it's all this planning and stuff that goes on. Plus, a lot of times they're coming into areas where they don't know people. So that's where we think AFCEA really has an advantage, because they can go to the local chapter and say, we'd like to do one in Atlanta. We'd like to do one in Savannah. They've done them at the ports, like Charleston, Savannah, and Houston, and They've done like, I think, 8 of them now since 2015. And so their idea is, if we have other people helping us do these, we can do more of them quicker, cheaper, but also if the local people are involved, they're more motivated and they're more appropriately situated. If West Point comes into Atlanta and doesn't have any contact to the city of Atlanta, doesn't know who the power, we had a conversation, they're like, you're lucky, you've got one power company. It's like, no, there's a dozen EMCs that are all part of that. So you can't just make one phone call and have the power company. You've got to have all of this. So, and then on the other side, AFCEA has had an issue because AFCEA as an organization is very heavily federal-centric, and within that, they're DOD-centric. So in Atlanta, our chapter's actually been around for 75 years. But our bases, Fort McPherson and Fort Gillem, Brackton, left us. And when they did, about half our membership left. So we kind of pivoted towards Homeland Security. But we've had to reach out and talk to folks. And it's like, we're really important. You should talk to us. We do good stuff. But a lot of them, until they saw these exercises in person, did not see the value in participating in FCA. Now, we've done it now 4 years. So we're getting more traction. The governor's office returns our phone calls. They send people to participate. The city's been there every time. So it's good, but it's not native to AFCEA's DNA. So there are places for us to grow. But the idea is if AFCEA and other folks, it doesn't have to be just AFCEA, do a handful of these a year, what data points are we getting? Are there any common failure points? Are there any themes that we're seeing? And so the idea is to develop a body of evidence. And, of course, they like to put out white papers and, research papers and stuff like that. So my goal is to help them get that data. But at the end of the day, to make things better and to make it more successful in an unstructured kind of a way. And then I try to purposely, because, the professors, they always want things to be structured. And they like that kind of stuff. But if you're living in the real world, you can't really have a structure defined. And to me, one of the best examples, and it's a very simple example, is that who in here works in the government or has worked in the government? Most of y'all? Okay. Do you have a COOP plan? Most organizations have had a COOP plans for a century or more, right? Headquarters gets blown up, I got to go somewhere else and reconstitute. Up until 4 or 5 years ago, no COOP plan involved working from home. Then all of a sudden, overnight, the Air Force, the Army, FBI.
It's actually 5 years. My grandson's 5 years now.
So time flies. But and it's a simple thing, because But if you'd have went to your commander and said, hey, what if we develop a plan to work from home? What if we got to? And it's conceivable. There were papers out there that I read back in the 90s that we were due for a pandemic. They didn't know why, there had not been a world pandemic. They were thinking...
Yeah, because Obama started the pandemic planning, because I remember having to buy laptops for all my DOJ feds and help them wire their homes.
It was one of these things that, we have more travel, more stuff going on, and we hadn't had a pandemic. So you can argue we should have been better prepared, but we weren't. So what aren't we testing today? What needs to be?
And this is also an opportunity for those people interested in doing these types of exercises. The story is out there that there are not enough cybersecurity professionals in the field to deal with it. Even Fairfax County, Loudoun County are short on these people. In your regional areas, partner with the university. You know why? If you have someone who's getting their degree in cybersecurity, and you can get the professors from the senior capstone or the graduate levels to give lecture credit or whatever to sit in on these exercises, it gives them a real live advantage to see how the real world plans for disasters. And we can get real feedback from the next generation that says, you guys were stupid, you didn't do this, or you guys did this really good, but you tweak it here to be better. And it gives us the constant feedback to then be better prepared for disasters. And for you IT people out there, You know how I used to test the build sheets for our servers when I had the engineering staff? The new hire, the guy fresh off the street hired, we'd give him the build sheet and say, okay, follow this build sheet, build us a new server. And if they said, this is wrong here, it's unclear, fix it. Here's our network diagrams. Here's how we have everything. Verify the data, follow it. Well, this is wrong here. Fix it. It's a great training tool, gets them familiar with your environment, gets them familiar with how you do your server builds, but that's the concept behind if you can partner with educational institutions. You know, Georgia Tech, you know, here we could partner with George Mason, or, you know, sorry, I don't know who's Baltimore's biggest
And-
college
and
is in
you
this
get-
way.
Sometimes you get that air of respectability, right? We've had this conversation a couple times at this conference, is that they do say we need more cybersecurity people. I heard somebody say the other day, we need smarter people. And I think that's the wrong way to approach the discussion, because nowadays, you know, people think you got to be a brain surgeon to get into cybersecurity, and that's simply not true. The vast majority of cybersecurity stuff is process, it's blocking and tackling. So if we say you got to be smart to get in, how are we going to develop a pipeline where people are learning and doing and becoming experts if they think they got to out of the gate be a genius? So you're really
I'm proof
doing
positive
something-
you don't have to be a genius, just for the record.
And it's a relatively new profession. You know, so a lot of people that are in cybersecurity didn't start in cybersecurity. They may have started in comms or IT or even marketing or you know, other
Paramedics?
things like that. Yeah, but it's more about the processes and learning. And then if you show an aptitude, then you can do the smart stuff, the cool stuff, right? But if you in America, we really have this dichotomy where you have people think, I'm a genius, I'm going to go in and I'm going to get a cybersecurity degree, and I'm going to come out making $150,000 the first year. Okay? I mean, I've had that conversation because there's such a need for it. Well, you got to come out, and I got news for you. A lot of these guys that are hiring you, they're not really interested in your degree. They want to see your GitHub. They want to see what you've done. You know, again, the way you're thinking, the way you approach a problem, how have you solved stuff. And then on the other hand, you got people that just don't even go into it, that may have the aptitude, but they don't think they're smart enough. So we've really done ourselves a disservice there. So when we do these exercises, we try to get the academic institutions involved. And one of the things that's a selling point is these are excellent. You know, we talked earlier about learning, meeting people, connections. It's a networking event at its heart. Are you around the people that do your job? If you're a cybersecurity professional, do you hang around other cybersecurity professionals, or are you, at the end of the day, done? I'm going home. I'm not going to be involved with this. A lot of them, where you see, they're doing very. They have CEUs. Now, this is a CEU. Hopefully, this is not a dry one. But a lot of CEUs tend to be very dry and very straightforward. So you're taking the required class, taking a certification or something. That doesn't really help your thinking processes. It doesn't really help you in the bigger picture thinking. So these kinds of exercises are big picture thinking, helping you be a little bit more flexible. When we've been approached with FC Atlanta to, whenever these exercises evolve, one of the other components that they want to add is a virtual component. So initially they were structured purposely to have everybody in the same room at the same time. But knowing that not everybody can be in the same room, and in the real world, people rarely are in the same room, what does a virtual exercise look like? Does that give you an opportunity to play around with stuff? Yeah, it gives you a lot more opportunity. There are actually companies out there that have roles, so everybody puts in an email, and your role can be assigned, and that's actually a very interesting thing, because if you put the guy in charge, all of a sudden at a street level role where he's got to respond to stuff maybe he's not used to, or maybe not having the whole responsibility, and then putting somebody at the street level in charge, now they've got to make decisions that have wide-ranging impacts, you can see their thought processes change. So it is a really good exercise to move people around in the roles, if you can, to help them do that. And by doing virtually with emails, there's some that have like an email set up, and then they've got a social media set up, and then they've got a link to maybe your incident response plan or whatever. So, and it could be that just somebody does a post on their version of Twitter or X, and sees how long it's going to take you to notice it. If somebody says, because in some of these things, you should have people monitoring that stuff. So, at these exercises, sometimes there is media. And we encourage that. What we don't encourage is recordings, again, attack type stuff. So photos, interviews type stuff like that. It's good for people to know that the government is doing these kinds of exercises. It's also good for people to see that and say, oh, I wonder if they thought about this. Because sometimes you get people calling in and asking about this, or I saw this, or I did this. And that might generate the next exercise. You've all heard about, the Watershed Authority actually, that attack actually came from real life. Down in Largo a couple years ago, they had an attack, and you're seeing all this stuff on like some of the power plants and stuff where there's a lot of concerns about that. The idea is that when we do these virtual ones, and it might be 5 or 10 FCA chapters, say in the Southeast, that are together at a time, responding to an incident that may have happened, and so we're working on what that incident might look like. What would be something that's wide ranging? And some of them, there was a bio thing that was and it wasn't an attack, but it was a failure that released a cloud in southeast Atlanta last year. All of a sudden, again, it doesn't take very hard to get into the traffic, but what are the comms? What are the environmental risks? What are the risks to all the stuff that's coming through? Atlanta is a huge hub for rail and highways. If you're ever on size 75, 24 hours a day, it's just 18-wheelers coming through. So if you stop that, what impact does it have down the line? It's such an impact in Georgia that they've now got something called inland ports, which is, it's a legal thing, but the Port of Savannah has grown so much, they take the traffic is just critical. They have created like basically staging areas, 3 or 4 areas in Georgia, and legally, as long as it doesn't come off the container, it's still in port. So they're in port even though they're in farmland in the middle of Georgia. But there's all of that stuff has cyber implications as well, because part of Georgia is still responsible. Georgia Center of Economic Development is heavily involved with that. So doing those kinds of exercises in a region is going to become more and more common. And what does that look like? So I think we've got like 5 minutes. Do y'all have any questions or concerns?
Stand up.
You're talking about, just with that, just when all these exercises are in play, how are you guys getting the vendor buy-in? A lot of the times I've seen they're sort of kind of disinterested in what's going on, especially when it comes to incidents and whatnot. They like to separate themselves and say, well, that's kind of your problem. If you find out it's our problem, let us know. But the onus has always been on us to prove it's a them problem.
Yeah, they do like to come in as the experts, right? They're going to come in and say, oh, this is how we would fix this for you. We try to avoid that. We try to avoid, vendor savior complex. But sometimes they do have a really good relationship with the government. They're embedded in state government. They're embedded in some of the military stuff. So you have to work with that.
Fair.
We try to make it as agnostic as possible. And again, FC has a good history of that, right? So we will listen and we'll say, okay, how would you solve this problem? But, and I come back from my AT&T. I was told at my very first presentation, you can't say AT&T good, Verizon bad. You can say, here's the way we think, here's the way we run the network, and I can't speak to how others do. So that's a very, valid discussion. But when you start talking about, others not being as good or you being superior to everybody else,
adversarial.
Yeah, it creates a bad environment, and you're setting yourself up for failure if you think you're the only guy that knows how to do something. So but we have, and sometimes there's behind the scene drug deals, right? It's like, if you sponsor the launch or whatever, we'll give you some time to speak, or we'll let you do some stuff. So
Some
it
wheeling
is-
and dealing, essentially.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
it's, at the end of and that's how we wound up with the exercise on election day, because the space was free and people were in town. But getting somebody to pay for food, getting somebody to pay for the space. So we have talked with universities about hosting, and some of them are actually really. The University of North Georgia does a lot of work with NSA and Homeland Security. They're interested. Georgia Tech is always in the mix. It's just finding a good time and a place to get everybody in.
I don't want to discourage anybody from doing this. That's not the purpose of it here. But please keep in mind that you don't have to be in Atlanta. You don't have to be a Baltimore. You don't have to be a Chicago or LA. If your chapter is in somewhat a smaller chapter, I think that makes it more important to be able to try and do these things. Because as large cities, LA, Chicago, New York, they're all used to being targets and being attacked and trying to figure a way around. But
That's a really, really good point.
even, I'm sorry, I'm a big city girl, I don't know it, but even like the areas like of Ottumwa, Iowa, for those of you of a certain age, know that, they have to have a plan, especially surrounding military bases. What was that lady in Atlanta? She's outside the Warner Robins, and it was like,
Mayor Patrick.
it was like, okay, if you have an incident in your town, does it affect the Air Force Base? And she's like, yeah. So what can you do as...
And they don't have the money. They don't have the resources.
But if they tag teamed, if they got the local universities in on helping them, and maybe learn some smart city things to apply to this, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. It's an exercise, a thought process, and how do we handle something when the worst possible scenario we can think of hits our town and our area?
One of the things that happens a lot, like in the very first thing we did, the city, Hartsfield Airport was there. Okay, so we're like, we're going to test them. So they performed perfectly. And when we talked to them, we're like, well, we thought, and they're like, yeah, we get attacked every day. We're the busiest airport in the world. We'd be idiots if we weren't prepared. We said, talk to the smaller airports who aren't your normal targets, because they're going to be the ones that are feeders into Hartsfield. They're going to be the ones that are getting stuff in. And I personally had not thought about that. I thought, it's a target of opportunity. So it's a lot of times, and we've talked with smaller chapters around, and the idea is, West Point might be able to do one every 18, 24 months. But if we've got 140 chapters around the world, most chapters meet every month or two. If they can just do one a year, that's still 140 exercises. And if they don't all have to be large, they can be tabletops of just small local agencies.
Whoever's over in Colorado Springs, you got the Air Force Academy. Do something with that. It's just ideas is we at the federal level, and I got to stop saying we because I'm no longer a Fed, but you're used to doing this like that. We are required by NIST, FSMA, and all the other federal requirements. State locals are not as familiar or exposed to that. So they don't have the experience. And if we can partner with bases, even small ones nearby, and educational.
Who's been really good at that? The National Guard. National Guard have been excellent. They are. Let me finish the sentence, and But a lot of times those guys during their National Guard duties, they work with civilian agencies, they work with commercial entities, but then during their day job during the week, they're doing the cybersecurity stuff too. So the National Guard has been like the best of these opportunities. They really bring a lot of good stuff.
Yes, good morning. I'm glad you brought up National Guard. My name is Tritran. I'm with Ubico. We make hardware security tokens for authentication. So I've
Huge fan.
What's that?
Huge fan.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've been actively working with the National Guard to help support their critical infrastructure protection exercises. So I'm engaged with Colorado and Virginia Cyber Fortress. So
Yeah.
what I'm seeing right now is there are states that are pretty advanced, and then some are just kind of starting.
Yeah.
Colorado's just kind of starting. So I'm just curious, is there some repository where all the exercises are being held by National Guard that we can go to?
So, I know people get tired of hearing this, but like now with the federal government, things are changing. But we're trying to work with West Point to have a repository of information on that. I think when you talk about some states are better, one of my favorite quotes of all time is William Gibson, a science fiction writer. He will say, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." And so you do see pockets of really capable people, capable organizations and facilities. Unfortunately, they are not uniform. So our job is to help disseminate that information, bring people up, and share best practices. I think we started a couple minutes late, so now we're a couple minutes over. So I think we've met the requirement for 1 hour. If there's any other questions, happy to talk. But get involved with these exercises. These are good things to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Not a problem.